Zzzpedia presents Nighttime Knowledge. The Library of Alexandria. Most people know what happened to the Library of Alexandria. It burned. The greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world, consumed by fire in a single night. The ancient historian Plutarch wrote that Caesar, besieged in the city, set fire to his own ships in the harbor, and that the flames spread on and destroyed the great library. It is one of the most famous tragedies in the history of civilization. A clean story, a villain, a fire, and everything lost. But that is not what happened, or rather, it is not all that happened. The real story of the Library of Alexandria begins 2 centuries before Caesar arrived, and it ends not with a fire, but with something quieter and harder to mourn. The library did not die in a single night. It died the way most institutions die, slowly, through neglect and political indifference, through the departure of the people who made it what it was. The building outlasted its purpose by centuries. The real story begins with an idea, and the idea begins with an exile. In 331 BC, Alexander the Great founded the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt. He chose a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and a large lake called Mareotis. The site had harbors facing in 2 directions, one toward Greece and the wider Mediterranean, one toward the interior of Egypt. A causeway connected the mainland to a small island called Pharos, where a lighthouse would eventually stand. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, visible to ships far out at sea. The city was designed from the beginning as a capital. It was not a settlement that grew into importance. It was built for it. Streets were laid out on a grid. Public buildings were planned before the first residents arrived. Alexandria was meant to be the center of the world Alexander was building, a city where Greek, Egyptian, and Mediterranean cultures met. Alexander died 8 years later. He was 32 years old. His empire was carved up among his generals. The one who took Egypt was a man named Ptolemy. He was a soldier who had fought beside Alexander for years, but he was also, unusually, a historian. He had written his own account of Alexander's campaigns, not as propaganda, but as a record. This was not a common pursuit among generals. Ptolemy made Alexandria his capital and founded a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Within a generation, the city he governed became the largest in the ancient world. Sometime around 295 BC, an exiled Athenian named Demetrius of Phalerum arrived at the Ptolemaic court. He had been a governor of Athens before the political wind shifted and drove him out. He was a student of the Aristotelian tradition, the same tradition that had produced the greatest private library of its era, Aristotle's own collection. Demetrius came to Alexandria as a refugee seeking the protection of the court, but he brought with him an idea. He proposed to the king that Alexandria should build a library, not an ordinary collection, a universal one, a place that would hold every book in the world. The ambition of the idea is worth sitting with. This was not a wealthy man building a private reading room. It was a state project, funded by the crown, backed by royal authority, aimed at gathering the entire written output of human civilization into a single institution. Nothing like it had been attempted before. Demetrius fell out of favor before the idea became a building, but the idea survived him. Under Ptolemy's son, Ptolemy II, known as Philadelphus, the library became real. It was built in the royal quarter of Alexandria as part of a larger campus called the Museion, a place dedicated to the 9 muses. The word itself is the ancestor of our word museum, though what the Museion most resembled was a university. The campus had Greek columns and a covered walkway where scholars could pace while they argued. There was a large circular dining hall with a high domed ceiling where the resident scholars ate their meals together. There were gardens and lecture halls and classrooms. Above the shelves where the papyrus scrolls were kept, an inscription read, "The place of the cure of the soul," and the arrangement that sustained this place was unlike anything in the ancient world. The scholars who came to work there were paid a salary by the crown. They were given free food and lodging. They were exempted from all taxes. They were asked to do only one thing: think. Between 30 and 50 men lived and worked on the campus at any given time. They had no obligation to produce anything on a schedule. They had no administrative duties. They had no military service. The Ptolemaic crown had taken the most talented minds it could attract from across the Greek-speaking world and freed them from every burden of daily life, with nothing expected in return except the advancement of human knowledge. The scholars ate together beneath a domed ceiling. They walked the covered arcades in the Mediterranean heat. They had access to the largest collection of written knowledge ever assembled. And they were left alone. Ptolemy II set a target of 500,000 scrolls for the collection. To reach it, he treated the acquisition of books with the same aggression other rulers applied to the conquest of territory. Royal agents were dispatched with large amounts of money to book fairs in the great trading cities of Rhodes and Athens. They had standing orders to prefer older copies over newer ones. An older copy was closer to the original author's hand, and therefore more valuable. The agents bought everything they could find. A story attributed to the physician Galen, writing centuries later, claims that the policy went further. Under a decree attributed to Ptolemy II, any ship entering Alexandria's harbor could have its books confiscated. Scribes at the docks would copy the texts, and the copies would be returned to the ship's owners. The library kept the originals. Whether or not this happened exactly as Galen described, he was writing centuries after the fact, and the story may have grown in the telling. It captures something true about the institution's appetite. The library did not wait for knowledge to arrive. It went out and seized it. A generation later, under Ptolemy III, that appetite produced one of the boldest thefts in intellectual history. The king borrowed the original manuscripts of the great Athenian tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, from the city of Athens itself. These were not ordinary copies. They were the official state manuscripts, the authoritative texts of the most important playwrights in the Greek language. Athens demanded a deposit of 15 talents of precious metal as guarantee of their return. Ptolemy paid it. He then had copies made on the finest papyrus available. He returned the copies to Athens. He forfeited his deposit, and he kept the originals. Athens received exquisite forgeries, while the library retained the real manuscripts. The scrolls accumulated faster than anyone had anticipated. They were papyrus rolls, sheets made from the reed plant native to the Nile Delta, dried and pressed and rolled into cylinders. Each scroll was tagged with a small label identifying its contents and where the manuscript had come from. The collection of Homeric texts alone included dozens of different versions, each tagged by origin. One from Athens, one from Chios, one from Sinope. Comparing these different copies, seeing where they agreed and where they diverged, was one of the library's core intellectual activities. Over time, the collection grew so large that the main building could not hold it all. A second library was opened in the temple of the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis across the city. They had simply run out of room. The first head librarian was a man named Zenodotus. He came from the city of Ephesus, and he faced a practical problem that no one in human history had faced before on this scale. The library held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. They contained the written output of centuries, philosophy and poetry, history and medicine, astronomy and mathematics, plays and speeches and letters. A scholar looking for a particular text had no way to find it except by searching through the shelves. How do you organize all of that so someone can find what they need? His solution was so simple that it is difficult to imagine a time before it existed. He arranged the scrolls in alphabetical order by the first letter of the author's name. It was the first known use of alphabetical order as an organizational tool. Before Zenodotus, the arrangement of written knowledge followed no system anyone could navigate by logic alone. After him, it had a principle. He also established canonical texts for Homer and the early Greek poets, comparing the many different manuscript copies the library had collected, deciding which readings were authentic and which were later corruptions introduced by generations of scribes. It was painstaking, unglamorous work. It required reading the same passages over and over in different versions, weighing one word against another. It was also the foundation on which everything that followed was built. But organizing the collection was only the beginning. A scholar named Callimachus took that work further than anyone could have imagined. Callimachus came from Cyrene, in what is now Libya. He had worked as a school teacher in Alexandria before coming under the patronage of Ptolemy II. His greatest achievement at the library was the Pina Keys, a catalog of every known Greek author and their works, organized first by genre, and then alphabetically within each genre. Each entry included the author's name, their birthplace, their father's name, and a complete list of every work they had written. The Pina Keys filled 120 scrolls, not pages, scrolls, each one a rolled sheet of papyrus, and there were 120 of them. An entire library just to describe the contents of the library. It was, in effect, the first searchable index of human knowledge, a tool that made the library not just large but usable. Without the Pina Keys, the collection was a vast warehouse. With it, a scholar could find any author, any work, any genre. Callimachus was never appointed head librarian, despite doing the library's most important organizational work. The catalog he built became the ancestor of every library catalog in the world. The Pina Keys itself has not survived. but its structure has been reconstructed from fragments and references in other works, and its organizing principles are still in use today. Then there was Eratosthenes. He came from Cyrene as well, and before arriving in Alexandria, he had studied philosophy in Athens under multiple traditions: Stoicism under its founder, Platonism, and other schools that the city offered. He was appointed head librarian by Ptolemy III at roughly 30 years of age, young for the position, but his range was extraordinary. His admirers called him Pentathlos, after the Olympic athletes who competed in 5 events. His critics called him Beta, number 2, because he excelled at many things but was the supreme master of none. Both nicknames revealed the same truth about the kind of mind the library cultivated. It did not reward narrow specialization. It rewarded the ability to see connections across fields, and no one in the ancient world saw connections the way Eratosthenes did. What he did with that ability remains one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of science. Somewhere in the library's vast collection of scrolls, there existed a survey record from southern Egypt. It noted that in the city of Syene, far up the Nile, the sun at noon on the summer solstice shone directly to the bottom of a deep well. That meant the sun was precisely overhead at that moment. It cast no shadow at all. The record had been sitting in the library, a piece of geographic data among thousands of other pieces of geographic data. Eratosthenes realized what it meant. On the same day, at the same hour, he measured the angle of a shadow cast by a vertical post in Alexandria, hundreds of miles to the north. There was a shadow. The sun was not directly overhead. The difference in the shadow angle, about 7 degrees, told him something extraordinary. It told him about the curvature of the earth between the two cities. He knew the distance between Syene and Alexandria. From the angle and the distance, using geometry, he calculated the full circumference of the planet. He was remarkably accurate. The knowledge had been sitting in the scrolls for years, maybe decades. The survey record, the distance between the cities, the geometry required to interpret the shadow, all of it was already in the library. Eratosthenes was the mind that saw what the pieces meant when placed together. He did not stop there. He created the first world map to use lines of latitude and longitude, dividing the globe into a grid that allowed any point on Earth to be described by 2 coordinates. He founded scientific geography as a discipline, and he was willing to challenge the received wisdom of his own time with a directness that could be withering. When other scholars at the library tried to identify real-world locations for the wanderings of Odysseus, mapping Homer's fictional voyage onto actual Mediterranean geography, Eratosthenes dismissed the entire project. A man might find the places of Odysseus's wanderings, he said, the day he found the leather worker who stitched the goat skin of the winds. Homer was a poet, not a cartographer. The library had given Eratosthenes the resources to measure the planet and the freedom to think clearly about what was real and what was not. Aristophanes of Byzantium held the position of head librarian after Eratosthenes. He looked at the way poetry was written out on scrolls, in continuous blocks of text, like prose, with no indication of where one line ended and the next began. and he decided to change it. He put each verse on its own line. It seems so obvious now that it is hard to imagine a time when poetry looked any other way. Before Aristophanes, reading a poem required knowing the rhythm well enough to hear the line breaks yourself. After him, the structure was visible on the page. He also invented the system of Greek accent marks that are still used today, diacritical marks that told the reader how to pronounce each word. These were not minor refinements. They changed the way an entire civilization read its own literature. The last great head librarian was Aristarchus of Samothrace. He was regarded in antiquity as the greatest scholar alive. Not the greatest living poet or the greatest philosopher, but the greatest scholar. A distinction that meant something specific. His specialty was Homer. He produced authoritative editions of the Homeric texts and wrote long, careful commentaries, line by line, word by word, questioning whether each passage was genuine or a later insertion by a copyist. When he believed a line had been added by a scribe rather than composed by the original poet, he marked it. His standards of textual analysis were so rigorous that later ancient scholars treated his opinions as final authority. For roughly a century and a half, the Library of Alexandria operated at this level. Minds like these, gathered in one place, funded by the state, freed from everything except the work itself. The first alphabetical index, the first library catalog, the first measurement of the earth, the first line breaks in poetry, the first rigorous method for determining whether a line of text was genuine or forged. Each of these achievements was made possible not by a single genius working in isolation, but by an institution that gathered knowledge and then gave brilliant people the time and resources to see what that knowledge contained. The scholars built on each other's work. Zenodotus organized the collection so Callimachus could catalog it. Callimachus cataloged it so Eratosthenes could find the survey record that let him measure the planet. The library was not just a collection of scrolls, it was a system, a place where knowledge accumulated and where the accumulation itself produced new knowledge that no single mind could have generated alone. And then, in a single year, it ended. In 145 BC, Aristarchus made a political mistake that scholars are not supposed to make. He backed the wrong claimant to the Egyptian throne. The claimant he supported, Ptolemy VII, was murdered. The man who seized power was Ptolemy VIII, known by the unflattering nickname Physcon. He was a ruler with no interest in scholarship and a long memory for disloyalty. Ptolemy VIII expelled every foreign scholar from Alexandria. The men who had been paid, housed, and fed by the crown, freed from all the burdens of daily life so they could advance human knowledge, were cast out of the city. Not gradually, not through reduced funding or slow attrition. They were expelled. The walkways where they had paced and argued were empty. The dining hall where they had eaten together beneath a domed ceiling was empty. The scrolls were still on the shelves. But the people who knew what to do with them were gone. Aristarchus fled to the island of Cyprus. He died there shortly after, an old man driven from the institution he had served for decades. The community of minds that had given the library its meaning scattered across the Mediterranean in a matter of months. The position that had belonged to Aristarchus, the greatest scholar of his generation, the man whose editorial judgments were treated as the final word on Homer, was given to a man named Cydas. Cydas was one of the king's personal guards, but the scholars who left Alexandria did not vanish, and what they built in exile may have mattered more than what they left behind. Aristarchus's student Dionysius Thrax settled on the island of Rhodes and wrote the first known book on Greek grammar. A concise, practical guide to speaking and writing the Greek language clearly. It was a short work, but it was so well constructed, so precisely suited to its purpose, that it remained the standard grammar textbook for Greek schoolboys for 1,300 years. A book written in exile by a refugee from the Library of Alexandria was still being used to teach children to read and write in the 12th century AD. Alexandrian methods of scholarship and analysis reached Rome within a generation of the purge. The intellectual tradition that had been concentrated in a single building was now spreading across the entire ancient world. The purge of 145 BC had shattered the institution, but it had also done something its founders never intended, and Ptolemy VIII certainly never imagined. It scattered the knowledge. The library itself survived the purge in a diminished form for centuries afterward. The physical building still stood, scrolls still lined the shelves, but the institution had lost the minds that made the scrolls matter. Caesar's fire in 48 BC, the one Plutarch described so dramatically, almost certainly did not destroy the library. When Caesar's soldiers set fire to Egyptian ships docked in the harbor during a civil war, the flames spread to parts of the city nearest the waterfront. Ancient sources disagree on exactly what burned. The Roman writer Seneca, quoting an even earlier historian, reported that 40,000 scrolls were destroyed. Plutarch's language is the most dramatic. He says the fire destroyed the great library, but other ancient historians describe only warehouses and buildings near the harbor, not the library itself, which stood in the royal quarter further from the waterfront. The modern scholarly consensus is that the fire damaged warehouses holding books near the docks, perhaps overflow storage, perhaps texts awaiting export. The main library was not destroyed. The evidence for survival is direct. The Greek geographer Strabo visited Alexandria decades after Caesar's fire and mentioned the Museion still standing. His account suggests the institution was a shadow of its former self, but it was there. A scholar named Didymus, working in Alexandria in the decades after the fire, wrote an estimated 4,000 books, the most prolific output of any known author in all of antiquity. He earned the nickname Bronze Guts for his relentless endurance and book forgetter, because he could not remember everything he had written. His output would have been impossible without access to a substantial collection of scrolls. Something survived Caesar's fire, but it was already fading. Under Roman rule, the slow decline continued for centuries. The nature of the institution changed in ways that were more damaging than any fire. Membership in the Museion was no longer awarded for scholarly distinction. It was awarded for service to the government, for military achievement, for success in athletics. Some members were not even required to live in the city. The Museion still existed, but it had become something closer to an honorary society then a working research institution. The word Alexandrian, which had once meant the highest standard of scholarship in the known world, changed its meaning too. It became a term of mild contempt, a synonym for pedantry, for the endless editing and re-editing of other scholars' work, without producing any original thought. The name of the greatest intellectual institution in ancient history became, under Rome, almost an insult. By the 260s AD, the last known scholars at the Museion fell silent. The institution simply disappeared from the historical record. No final entry, no closing ceremony. It was just no longer mentioned by anyone. The building, or what remained of it, had one more chapter, but it was an epilogue to a story that had already ended. In 272 AD, the Emperor Aurelian fought to recapture Alexandria from a rival empire. His forces destroyed the royal quarter of the city, the same quarter where the library had stood for 5 centuries. If the building survived, it did not survive this. In 297 AD, the Emperor Diocletian besieged the city and destroyed the same quarter again. The daughter library in the Serapeum lasted longer than anyone might have expected. It was housed in a functioning pagan temple with classrooms for philosophers, still in active use in the 380s, nearly 500 years after the library was founded. Scholars and students still gathered there to teach and learn. In 391 AD, after the Christian bishop Theophilus paraded desecrated pagan objects through the streets of Alexandria, the philosophers and students at the Serapeum took up arms to defend the building. They mounted a brief, fierce resistance. It was a futile gesture. Christians demolished the temple in the aftermath. Whether any significant collection of scrolls still existed inside by that point is unclear. Scholars believe it did not, but the image lingers. Teachers and students taking up weapons to defend a place of learning and losing. In 415 AD, Hypatia, a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher who was the last major figure of Alexandrian scholarship, was murdered by a Christian mob in the streets of Alexandria. Her school collapsed after her death. Philosophical teaching continued in the city for another century, but the tradition she represented was broken. 2 centuries later, in 642 AD, Arab forces captured Alexandria. A story appeared, written roughly 500 years after the event, claiming that the Caliph Umar had ordered the library's books destroyed. If those books are in agreement with the Quran, we have no need of them. And if these are opposed to the Quran, destroy them. The books were said to have been burned as fuel for the city's bathhouses. It is a dramatic story. It is almost certainly false. Historians across multiple traditions agree that the library had ceased to exist centuries before the Arab conquest. The story was probably invented as political propaganda, written 600 years after the supposed event, and it serves the same purpose as Plutarch's account of Caesar's fire. It gives us a villain and a single moment of destruction. It replaces a complicated truth with a clean one. The real story does not end with a fire or a command. It does not end with a villain at all. The Library of Alexandria was built to hold all human knowledge in one place. For a century and a half, it came closer to that goal than any institution before or since. And its greatest contribution to civilization was not what it preserved. It was what scattered when it fell apart. The scholars Ptolemy VIII expelled in 145 BC did not disappear into exile. They founded schools across the Mediterranean, from Rhodes to Pergamum to Rome. They wrote textbooks that lasted more than 1,000 years. They carried methods of analysis and standards of evidence that shaped how the ancient world thought about knowledge itself. The grammar of Dionysius Thrax, written on an island by a man who had been driven from the greatest library ever built, outlasted the library by 13 centuries. Centuries after the purge, Islamic translators working under the Abbasid Caliphate preserved Greek texts that had passed through Alexandrian hands, translating them into Arabic, keeping them alive through the long centuries when Europe had largely forgotten them. The institution built to gather all knowledge in one place ended up spreading it further than its walls ever could have. That is the irony at the center of this story. The library was designed for preservation. Its greatest act was dispersal. The idea that all knowledge could be held in one place turned out to be fragile. The knowledge itself was not. The library did not die because someone set it on fire. It died because a king valued loyalty over learning, because funding dried up, because the position of head librarian became a reward for political service, rather than a recognition of intellectual achievement. The myth of a single burning persists, because it is simpler and more satisfying than the truth. Perhaps because it is easier to mourn a sudden loss than a slow forgetting. After the purge, the position that had belonged to Eratosthenes, the man who measured the circumference of the earth, using nothing but shadows, angles, and the distance between two cities, belonged to a palace guard. The scrolls were still on the shelves. The building still stood. But the library, in every way that mattered, was already empty.